Shalom and welcome to Nalar Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis, and this is teaching number 8 as we focus on Genesis chapter 5. I titled this teaching, The Prophetic Generations of Adam. Now, as we do a little bit of review at the beginning of this teaching, in Genesis chapter 4, I titled that teaching, What Does God Expect from Humanity? And one of the clear expectations that God has for humanity is to call upon his name. We read this in the very end of Genesis 4, verse 26. At that time, there was a beginning of calling upon the name of the Lord. When humanity pursues this simple expectation, God promises the greatest gift of all, which is salvation. And we read this prophesied in Joel chapter 2, verse 32, and it will come about that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And we saw how that is quoted a couple of times in the New Testament. Now, another simple but profound expectation of God for humanity is recorded in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, as you see it on your screen. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. God expects humanity to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with him. Such a basic thing, or these principles are so basic. However, they are universal truths that God requires from each and every one of us. Now, a couple more questions to be thinking about. What does it mean to walk with God? As we talk about this whole subject of walking with God, what is the outcome of the life of one who walks with God? Now, in Genesis chapter 5, we read of one who walked with God. I think we'll find clear answers to these questions as we work our way through this chapter. Let's begin with Genesis 5, verses 1 to 2. Quote, "This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created Adam. He made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them, and he called their name Adam," right? Or in English, Adam, in the day that he created them. So a few more questions to consider as we work our way through this teaching. Number one, if Genesis 5 records the generations of Adam, why are Cain and Abel not included in this genealogy? Number two, what is the purpose of the Genesis 5 genealogy? Number three, what is the meaning and significance of the names and ages detailed in the generations of Adam? And number four, a repeat of the questions I just asked a minute ago. What does it mean to walk with God? And number five, what is the outcome of the life of the one who walks with God? So as we go through this teaching, hopefully we'll find clear answers to these various questions. Now, in the opening sentence to Genesis 5:1, we read in the Hebrew, Ze Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Now, this word Toldot is translated as generations, and it's the same word we saw back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, and I talked about it a bit then. Just to read that verse again, Genesis 2:4, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made earth and heavens." Now, the Genesis 2 creation account gives a much different perspective from the Genesis 1 account. The Genesis 2 account is more relational in nature, as the following detailed events reveal. And again, this is review, but I just want to point out the highlights of events that we see in Genesis 2 and how it makes it unique from Genesis 1 regarding the creation account. Number one, God made Adam from the dust of the earth. Number two, God planted the Garden of Eden. Number three, God placed Adam in the garden to work and to keep it. Number three, God made the birds and animals from the dust of the earth. Number five, God brought the birds, animals, and creatures of the field to Adam to be named. Number six, Adam gave names to all of the birds and animals. Number seven, God declared that it is not good for man to be alone. Number eight, God uniquely created Eve, building her from Adam's rib. And number nine, Adam and Eve came together as the first husband and wife in the fear and wisdom of God, living in perfect innocence when they were naked and unashamed. So the creation account that we see in Genesis 2 is a foundational description of how God interacted with his creation with a focus on Adam and Eve, the original couple, who would bring forth the generations to come. That's why we read in Genesis 2:4, it begins with this phrase, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth," and ends with the perfect unity of Adam and Eve, as we read in Genesis 2:25, "And the two of them were naked, the man and his woman, but they were not ashamed." Genesis 3 obviously and famously records the fall of man and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And then Genesis 4, we see how the majority of the context of Genesis 4 is on the account of Cain and Abel, followed by the lineage of Cain. Now, in Genesis 5, we read this introduction. This is the book of the generations of Adam. This book of the generations of Adam continues with a brief third account of God's creation of man as we continue in verses 1 to 2. Just to read them again. In the day that God created Adam, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them, and he called their name Adam in the day that he created them. Now, in the Genesis 5 account, we are reminded of the following details. Number 1, he made him, Adam, in the likeness of God. Number 2, male and female, he created them. And number 3, he blessed them. Now, all of these details are included in the original creation account in Genesis 1, 26 to 28. However, we uniquely read one exception. The one exception being, quote, and he called their name Adam, right, or Adam, in the day that he created them. So as noted in the Genesis 4 teaching, the Hebrew word Adam is both the name of the first man as well as a general word for man, mankind, or humanity. And it's very similar to the name or the word Enosh as we see it used throughout the scriptures. God called them, Adam and Eve, Adam, man, right, in a general sense. Now, in God's foreknowledge, he made sure to repeat the detail from Genesis 1 of how he created them, quote unquote, male and female, so that the evil agenda in this world would not dilute God's calling Adam and Eve by the term Adam, right, man. Now, after this third account of the creation of Adam and Eve, we begin to read the names and details regarding the generations of Adam. So let's read verses 3 to 5. And Adam lived 130 years, and he begot one in his likeness according to his image, and he called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he begot Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Adam that he lived were 930 years. Then he died. Now, in this genealogy, we read the name Seth, who was born to Adam and Eve when they were 130 years old. We know from Genesis 4 that Cain and Abel were born to Adam and Eve before Seth. So again, a question, why are Cain and Abel not listed in this book of the generations of Adam in Genesis chapter 5? So as noted in the previous teaching, the lineage of Cain was marked by violence and murder, starting with Cain and continuing through to Lamech, the fifth generation from Cain. Since Cain murdered Abel and his life was taken early, it appears that Abel never had children. Eve acknowledged that Seth was born in a timely manner after the murder of Abel, and she named him Seth because she said that God appointed another son or seed in place of Abel. Genesis 5 follows the line of Seth and establishes a distinct lineage that is separate from the line of Cain as recorded in Genesis chapter 4. Now, although some of the names are familiar or similar or even the same in Genesis chapters 4 and 5, there is no connection to the generations of Cain and Seth. Outside of they're both descended from Adam, right? But other than that, they are two distinct lineages. We often see in the scriptures how you have similar names in similar generations. Now, the generations of Adam through his son Seth are recorded in such a way to show themselves to be men who walked with God. We will now continue with the complete list of generations up to the end of Genesis 5. So I'm literally going to read the rest of Genesis 5, which is one long genealogy, and I encourage you to pay attention to the details. So this is Genesis chapter 5, verses 6 to 32, where we read, And Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. And after begetting Enosh, Seth lived 807 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years. Then he died. And Enosh lived 90 years, and he begot Canaan. And after begetting Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Enosh were 905 years. Then he died. And Canaan lived 70 years, and he begot Mahalalel. And after begetting Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years. Then he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years, and he begot Yered. And after begetting Yered, Mahalalel lived 830 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. And Yered lived 162 years, and he begot Chanok. And after begetting Chanok, Yered lived 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Yered were 962 years. Then he died. And Chanok lived 65 years, and he begot Metushelach. And after begetting Metushelach, Hanok walked with God for 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Hanok were 365 years. And Hanok walked with God. But then he was no more, because God took him. And Metushelach lived 187 years, and he begot Lamech. And after begetting Lamech, Metushelach lived 782 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Metushelach were 969 years. Then he died. And Lamech lived 182 years, and he begot a son. And he called his name Noach, saying, "This one will give us rest from our works, and from the hardship of our hands, from the ground which the Lord has cursed." And after begetting Noach, Lamech lived 595 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years. Then he died. And Noach was 500 years old, and Noach begot Shem, Ham, and Japhet. So that is the reading of Genesis 5 to the end. Now, in this list of the quote-unquote, the book of the generations of Adam, we see certain things that each one has in common with the other, and certain things which are unique. I want to begin with the ages from Adam to Noach, right? And again, I tried to do my best to transliterate the Hebrew names into English. And for the ones that are close, like Adam, I'll just simply say the English Adam. And Shet, I'll just simply say Seth. But the other ones, I'll try to pronounce them as they are seen in the scriptures. So Adam lived 930 years, Seth lived 912 years, Enosh lived 905 years, Canaan lived 910 years, Mahalalel lived 895 years, Yered 962 years, Chanok lived 365 years, right? He did not die. We'll get more into that. Metushelach lived 969 years. Lamech lived 777 years. And Noach lived 950 years. We don't read it here, but we read it in Genesis 9:29. Now, the average lifespan from Adam to Noach is 912 years. And that's excluding Hanok, since he left very early and did not die, right? But that's the average lifespan at that time, 912 years. Now, who lived the longest and who lived the shortest amount of years on earth, as we read it in Genesis 5? So there are two people, and these two people are related as father and son. Hanok only lived 365 years on earth, and then God took him. Metushelach lived 969 years, and then he died, right? And again, Metushelach is the son of Hanok, so it's a father-son duo. Now, Lamech also lived a somewhat shorter life, and it's worth pointing out that the years of Lamech's life are unique and significant at 777 years. Throughout the scriptures, the number 7 is the number of fulfillment and completion, and it is also the number of God. At 777 years, Lamech died relatively young compared to the others in his generation, while with the average age being 912 years. So what is the significance of Lamech living to be 777 years old? Lamech died 595 years after the birth of his son Noach. We understand from the scriptures that God called Noach to build the ark at the age or around the time that he was 500 years old. And then Noach spent about 100 years building the ark until the flood came when he was 600 years old, as we read in Genesis 7:6. So according to the years of Noach, Lamech died 5 years before the flood. Now, it appears to be the grace of God to call Lamech home before God's judgment by the flood, right? Lamech died a natural death as far as we know, but he died 5 years before the flood. Now, from this list of the names of the generations in Genesis 5, they are all recorded to have died except for 5 people. So a question to ask again, who are they, these 5 people, and why are these 5 particular people not recorded in Genesis 5 as having died? So I think the simplest answer to this is God had other plans, right? And we read in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, the mind of plan The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps, right? So it's always good to allow God to direct our steps as we go through the course of life. So the first one we come to who didn't die was Hanok, right? And we read how Hanok walked with God, but then he was no more because God took him, right? And that's in verse 24. Now, Hanok is uniquely spoken of as one who walked with God, and then he was not because God took him. And just to mention here, the name Hanok, as you see it there in Hebrew, is transliterated into English, most translations, as Enoch, right? And there's such a huge gap there between Hanok and Enoch, but it's probably through the Greek and the Latin, whatever, then you eventually get to the English. But just to say the original name for Enoch is Hanok. Now, this is a unique act of God to take a human being alive from the earth to be with him without experiencing a physical death. And we know that the same thing happened to Elijah when he was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, as we read in 2 Kings 2:11. Now, Hanok lived 365 years on this earth. So what do the 365 years of Hanok's life tell us? What can we learn from his life? So the years of Hanok's life correlate to the full amount of calendar days per year according to the solar system that God established, 365 days. Similar to Lamech's lifespan of 777 years, Hanok's 365 years also speak of completion and fulfillment. I think we see a direct correlation there, right? Now, Hanok walked with God, and God took him, uniquely sparing him from physical death. The other four who are not recorded as having died in Genesis 5 are Noah and his 3 sons. Now, clearly, Noah and his 3 sons died a natural death, as far as we know, but they're not recorded here as dying. And we know that God had a special purpose for Noah and his family, therefore they are uniquely mentioned here without having a reference to their death. Now, whereas in every other generation only one son was named, all of Noah's sons are named because God's plan of salvation involved all 3 of them, right? So Noah and his 3 sons. Now we also read a specific prophecy about the life of Noah in Genesis 5, and we'll spend the majority of the time focusing on that. The name of Noah's father was Lamech, and in every previous generation, as we see it in Genesis 5, read the name of the son born to the father. However, for Lamech, the text reads, quote, "And Lamech lived 182 years, and he begot a son," without giving a name in verse 28. We then read how Lamech spoke a word of prophecy over his son's life while explaining the name that he chose for his son. So we read this in Genesis 5:29, "And he called his name Noah, saying, This one will give us rest from our works and from the hardship of our hands, from the ground which the Lord has cursed." Beautiful prophecy, but a couple of questions to think about. Number one, how was this prophecy fulfilled in Noah's life? Number two, did Noah give rest from our works, from the hardship of our hands, and from the curse of the ground? And if so, how? How did this realize itself? Now we know that God used Noah and his family to preserve and continue life on the earth after God destroyed the earth with a flood. This account is detailed in the coming chapters 6 to 9, and we will answer these questions more fully in the coming teachings. Now there are a few more details in Genesis 5 that help us understand this prophecy regarding Noah. Now in closing, I say that as really as being about halfway through this teaching, but I'm going to spend the rest of the time focusing on the meanings of the names and ages of the generations of Adam that connect with the prophetic word of Lamech regarding his son Noah giving rest to the people. And we're going to do so looking at scriptures all over the Bible, Old and New. Now, Hebrew names generally carry significant meaning and are sometimes used in a prophetic manner. Now, I've listed the names as we translate them or transliterate them, right, from the Hebrew, and then the meanings of their names the best I can. So Adam is man or mankind, right? So Seth or Shet is appointed or placed, and we've talked about those in the past, as well as Enosh, right, which is human, man, or mankind, very similar to Adam. Canaan means possession, very similar actually to the name, same root as Cain or Cain. Mahalalel is one who praises God. Yered is to descend or descent. Chanok means dedicated or trained. Metushelach means sent to their death. And then Lamech means We don't know. There's actually no good definition of the word or name Lemech. We don't see it anywhere else in the scriptures. But I wonder if we simply identify him with his amount of years that he lived on the earth for 777 years, a time of completion. So that's how I best identify his life and his name. And then we have Noach, which simply means rest. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, the generations of Adam literally record the genealogical account of humanity, but they also provide a prophetic word regarding Noach that was fulfilled in history and is yet to be fulfilled. Noach was used in his day to build an ark and provide salvation for his family and for the creatures that entered the ark with him. So Noach provided a type of rest for creation at that time. And I think that's obviously something we see in the scriptures. Now, we also read in the scriptures in a general manner about the rest of God, which is promised for humanity and is made available to each one of us. We read of this rest in Hebrews chapter 4, and we will see later how it connects back to Noach. So again, I'm going to be looking at different scriptures and then tying them back to the prophecy about Noach. So we read this in Hebrews chapter 4. Quote, therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he has said, quote, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, unquote, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. So that's Hebrews 4, 1-3, and I included that quote in there, which is that highlighted sentence on your screen, which is quoting from Psalm chapter 95, and I want to explain the significance of that. So as you go back to that verse in Psalm 95, it's actually the last part of that paragraph there, verse 11. I'm going to read it in context, Psalm 95, 9-11, where we read this. When your fathers tested me, they tried me, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who err in their heart, and they do not know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, truly they shall not enter into my rest. Now the Hebrew word here for my rest is menuchati. The Hebrew word menucha, right, just standing alone without the first person possessive there. Menucha comes from the Hebrew word Noach, meaning rest, right? And again, I highlighted the name Noach in Hebrew, as well as we see the root of it there in Menucha, right above in pink. Now, the context of Psalm 95:11 is referring back to what happened during the 40 years in the desert when the nation of Israel disobeyed the Lord. And I just want to read a couple more verses that give us context with this whole subject. So going back to Deuteronomy 1:35, not one of these men, this evil generation, shall see the good land which I swore to give your fathers. To enter Oh, sorry. So that's, I thought it was continuing with that. So just Deuteronomy 1:35, not one of these men, this evil generation, shall see the good land which I swore to give to your fathers, right? And I make the point that to enter into God's promised land is equated with entering into God's rest. And I want to just show that more from Deuteronomy 12, verses 8-9, where we read, you shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which the Lord God is giving you. And I highlighted these phrases, the resting place and the inheritance, right? Because the phrase resting place is the same Hebrew word used in Psalm 95, menucha, which means either rest or resting place, right? Because every Hebrew word generally has 2, 3, 4, even 5 meanings. Now, the Hebrew word for inheritance is nachala and simply means inheritance. Now, the rest of God and the inheritance of God for his people speak of the same promise. The prophecy of Noach, rest, speaks beyond the deliverance from the flood, which we saw in history. Entering into the rest of God, which he promises to his people, is not primarily focused on geography, but on relationship and eternity with him, right? Not simply going into the promised land. I live here today in the state of Israel, but it's more that spiritual rest of God that he offers every one of us, that eternity of being with him. Now, just to compare the two lineages of Adam, right? We have Adam's natural lineage, which began with Cain, the firstborn son, who was a murderer and whose successive generations continued in violence that spread upon the earth. Adam's prophetic generations began with Seth, whom God appointed to Adam and Eve after the death of their firstborn son, Abel. Seth's firstborn son was Enosh, who speaks of humanity through his name. And it was in the days of Enosh that men began to quote unquote call upon the name of the Lord. Now, Hanok is the seventh generation through the line of Seth, Adam being the first generation. Hanok was the man who called upon the name of the Lord, and it was recorded about him, quote, and Hanok walked with God for 300 years after he begot Methuselah, right? We read that in Genesis 5:22. There is no greater honor than to be recorded as one who walks with God all the days of one's life. As a result of Hanok's or Enoch's walk with God, his life is included in Hebrews 11. So again, I'm going to just read Hebrews 11 with the name, as we see in English, Enoch, right? So it's the same person as Hanok. And we read this: By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. That's Hebrews 11, verses 5 and 6. And here we read about Hanok or Enoch as a man of faith whom God chose to take from this earth so that he would not see death, right? Simply quoting what we already see back in Genesis 5. Hanok walked with God and lived a life of faith. Now, although we don't read many of the other details about his life, Hanok's life was marked by, number one, one who lived by faith, number two, one who walked with God, and number three, one who was pleasing to God, which we specifically read in Hebrews 11. Hanok left a powerful legacy of faith, right? One who walked with God. Hanok's life reminds us that God rewards those who diligently seek him. So I specifically included the verse after Hebrews 11:5 that speaks of what it means to live in faith, right, in Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's impossible to be well-pleasing to him, for he who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Now, Hanok is also mentioned in the New Testament book of Jude. I just want to read these two verses here and then explain it a little bit. Where we read this in Jude 1:14-15. It was also about these men that Enoch, or Hanok, right, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. This is a powerful word as we read it in Jude 1:14-15. Now, it's believed that Jude is quoting from the book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal book which is not included in the Jewish or Christian scriptures. And just to mention, sometimes we think of an apocryphal book as something evil, but it's not. It's simply a book that's not included in the Bible as scripture, but it's very well a historical book that we can use just as Jude used it in his day. Now, the book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish book that is accredited to Hanok, the great-grandfather of Noah, right? So an amazing preservation. We don't know all the details about it, but it's neat to see how it's quoted in the book of Jude. Now, the quote that Jude quotes is from the book of Enoch, and I just want to read what we see in the book of Enoch, the first book of Enoch, or book 1 of Enoch, in chapter 1, verse 9, where we read this. Again, this is quoting from the book of Enoch, where we read this. And behold, he cometh with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh of all the works of their ungodliness, which they have ungodly committed, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So again, this is a quotation from the book of Enoch in the New Testament book of Jude, and it really shows how authoritative it was 2,000 years ago in the first century among believers in Yeshua, just as it's quoted here in Jude chapter 1. There's only one chapter. Now, the manner in which Hanok walked with God and was used by God to prophesy of things to come testifies to his life. Hanok understood the days in which he lived thousands of years ago, and he walked so closely with God that God used him to prophesy about the destruction and judgment that would come upon the earth because of the evil and ungodly ways of mankind that were so prevalent upon the earth at that time. Now, the prophecy in the book of Enoch contextually refers to the end times judgment, meaning that which is even still to come in our time, the Great Tribulation. That's actually how the book 1 of Enoch, chapter 1, begins. However, Jude spoke of it as being in the past tense 2,000 years ago, as something that was fulfilled in the days of the flood, right, when God destroyed the earth. And just to say, there are many prophecies in the scriptures that have two or more fulfillments, meaning it can be telescoping. It can be something that was done in the past, fulfilled in the past, as well as something that also speaks of the future. We see this many times in the scriptures. Now, we see a clear prophecy fulfilled in the pages of the Bible that was spoken by Hanok in Genesis 5. So I want to speak into another prophecy that we clearly see in the text of Genesis 5. Now, Hanok named his son Metushelach, which is a combination of two Hebrew words, lamut, meaning to die, and lishloach, meaning to send. So the way Metushelach is written, it can be translated either as A, sent to their death, or B, send them to die. Now, either way, it is not a happy name. I do not encourage you to name your child this name unless you really hear from God. Now, it appears from what we read in the scriptures that Hanok named his son Metushelach as a means of speaking prophetically about the judgment of that generation as they would be sent to their death by the flood which God brought upon the earth. We know that Lamech, Noah's father, died 5 years before the flood, which appears to be the mercy and providence of God, which I've already mentioned. Now, when did Metushelach die? Metushelach was the father of Lamech and the grandfather of Noah. Metushelach was 187 years old when he begot Lamech. Lamech lived 777 years and died 5 years before the flood. Metushelach was the oldest man to have ever walked this earth, and he lived to be 969 years old. Now, Metushelach was 964 years old when his son Lamech died at 777, right? We talked earlier about the significance of all these ages and the different meanings of their names, right? So Metushelach lived up until the very year of the flood, 5 years after his son Lamech died. In the year that Metushelach died, his name was fulfilled. They were, quote unquote, sent to their death. Now, we don't know if Metushelach died before or at the flood, but he died in that year as we add up the years. Only Noach and his family were saved by obedience to the word of the Lord. So now I really am going to bring this teaching to a conclusion. So I have some concluding thoughts regarding this teaching on the prophetic generations of Adam. Hanok was a man who walked with God, and he prophetically spoke into his generation through the name of his son, Metushelach. Lamech spoke prophetically regarding his son, Noah, who would give rest to mankind. Lamech then lived a full and complete life to the age of 777 years old, and then he died. Lamech was a man who called on the name of the Lord during the days of his life. He simply prophesied about his son, Noah. Now, Noah walked with God, and God used him to bring rest to the earth. The final 4 generations of Adam through his son Seth are Hanok, Metushelach, Lamech, and Noah. All 4 of these men were men of faith, whom God used in one way or another. Hanok walked so closely with God that God took him from the earth to be with him, and he did not see death. God's desire for every one of us is that we walk humbly with him by faith every day. And I just want to conclude this teaching with a few introspective questions that each one of us needs to ask. Number 1, are you walking humbly with God today? Number 2, are you living a life of faith? And number 3, are you speaking into this generation? It's easy to read the quote-unquote prophetic generations of Adam as ancient history. We are called to walk in faith today, to speak into the generation that we are living amongst today. A prophet of God spoke a word to King Asa of Judah many centuries ago, as we read in 2 Chronicles 16:9, part A, the first half of that verse, which reads, quote, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." Such a beautiful promise. Let us walk in faith with God today, be strengthened by God, and be those who speak prophetically into our generation. This is the conclusion to Genesis chapter 5, the prophetic generations of Adam. I hope we answered all the questions adequately. Here's some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. And as always, I want to encourage you to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with us. Nether Glide is a nonprofit organization, and we're completely dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly emails if you're not already subscribed, so that you can keep up to date with our teachings. And you can do so by going to netherglide.com or simply scanning the QR code on your screen, and it will take you right to netherglide.com. And you can either click the give or subscribe tabs as needed. So thank you so much. God bless you, and look forward to seeing you again next time.